It's kind of funny that the free agency period comes before the draft, and we're already so deep into draft season. Like with the Niners specifically, it feels like so much of how they'll go about the draft depends on what happens with Travarius Ward in free agency and what happens with Dre Greenlaw in free agency and what happens um, on the offensive line. Is there a veteran center they can go get, or do they have to prioritize that early in the first round? Like there's so many different things that can happen in free agency that'll change how the 49ers attack the draft. But what we've kind of seen in early mock drafts is it's offensive or defensive line for the 49ers. It's Will Campbell from LSU or Josh Simmons from Ohio State or Armand Membu from Mizzou, Cotton Bowl Classic champion Armand Membu. Um, there's more. Kelvin Banks from Texas is the other popular one, and then there's various defensive ends and defensive linemen who have been mocked to the 49ers. But Daniel Jeremiah has a really interesting one in his second mock draft, and it's Michigan cornerback Will Johnson going to San Francisco at 11. Kind of interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
Right, that's our pod.
no, I think, look, I think you and I are both coming from the same school of thought here that the Niners just need to get better in the trenches on both sides.
Yeah.
And I think that's a pretty common belief, among, quote unquote draft analysts all over the internet, is that the Niners need to beef up the offensive line, be better in key, third down situations against blitzes, i.e. the Super Bowl a couple years ago. And obviously run blocking, I think is a area that the 49ers really need to improve going into this next season. So yeah, the offensive line absolutely makes sense. You don't always get to pick in the top 15. So if you can get an offensive tackle, particularly with Trent Williams nearing his retirement, getting a potential replacement there makes all the sense in the world. You can play him at left guard, maybe with Aaron Banks hitting free agency until Trent Williams retires, or you could play him at right tackle, depending on how you feel about Colton McKivitz. Obviously, the 49ers need to upgrade the defensive line. You basically have a bunch of question marks outside of Nick Bosa. But one position that hasn't gotten talked about is cornerback. And
Mm-hmm.
I think in large part, the reasoning behind that is because you had a really strong rookie season from Renardo Green, and you have Diamador Lenore, who can play outside and inside, and has pretty much, I think, evolved into the 49ers' best player in their secondary over the last couple of years. Just from a consistency standpoint, from a versatility standpoint. They signed him to a contract, so he sort of embodies everything that they want, right, at that position.
Mm-hmm.
But because you have Renardo Green and Diamador Lenore, I think cornerback kind of goes under the radar in terms of an actual need for the team. And I think you can make a pretty strong argument, particularly like basically all of their other cornerbacks are free agents,
Mm-hmm.
that you could definitely add a corner. In fact, they probably need to add another corner who can play a lot of snaps this offseason. And I
Mm-hmm.
guess where the conversation goes to in regards to Will Johnson is, do you say, okay, they definitely need a third cornerback. Do you
Mm-hmm.
do that in the draft with a premium pick like number 11,
Mm-hmm.
and get a potential, somebody you think could be a Pro Bowl type talent? Or do you say, yeah, we don't really need to invest that premium of an asset into potentially your second or third cornerback? Can you go get DJ Reed at a reasonable rate in free agency, or Byron Murphy, or take a chance on Jeff Okuda or Kendall Fuller, or
Mm-hmm.
Stephon Gilmore is way up there in age but is coming off a really nice season. There are free agent options that are less costly from an asset standpoint than the 11th overall pick. But I think, if they, like, my take on the Will Johnson thing is, if he's the best player on the board, I don't think they should avoid taking him just because he's not a trenches player. I think ultimately, as
Sure.
much as the 49ers need to improve the trenches, they just need high level Pro Bowl type talents. And if Will Johnson's that guy, then go ahead and take him. It's a premium position.
Mm-hmm.
And given all of the receivers in the NFC West, you certainly wouldn't be mad to have another premium cornerback there, particularly with Travarius Ward expected to leave in free agency.
So this would also fall into, we talked about this a little bit during the season when they paid Diamador Lenore, and then remember last year when they took Renardo Green in the second round, that's the earliest that they had taken a corner in the John Lynch, Kyle Shanahan era. And I kind of wondered if like, hey, they're transitioning the way they're going to build their defense a little bit, where they've had a really hard time finding good defensive linemen since DeForest Buckner left, and I actually wrote about this at NinersWire.com. Their drafting at defensive line has been kind of a disaster since the Nick Bosa pick, and really even before the Nick Bosa pick. And maybe this is just the move. Will Johnson falls to you at 11. I've seen other mocks where he goes much earlier than that. And maybe that's just the value play. And the 49ers, who want to be this front to back defense, are all of a sudden looking at their team building, what they have available now, what's available in the draft, and they go, to hell with it. We're just going to load up in the secondary and then try and piece together a defensive line instead of vice versa. And that's where this makes sense to me. Maybe like so the next 3 picks in Jeremiah's mock, it's Walter Nolan from Mississippi, a defensive tackle. Tyler Booker, an interior offensive lineman from Alabama, and then Armand Membu, who we talked about earlier, an offensive tackle from Mizzou. It's like if the Niners are like, yeah, okay, those guys are fine, but we think that Will Johnson should have been a top 3 player in this draft, it makes sense to do it that way instead of doing, frankly, what I think they've done in the past, where they've been like, we need a defensive tackle, we're just going to take one. We need a defensive tackle, so we're taking Javon Kinlaw. And I think that's kind of how they've operated in the past. And this is a spot where you made the point the other day, and I know it's kind of tongue in cheek, but I think it gets overlooked in the crush of draft analysis, is like, just take dudes who can play. Forget need sometimes, forget positional value. That's the Lions. The Lions got freaking flambéed for the draft, where they added Sam Laporta and Jahmyr Gibbs, and then is it Jack Campbell, the linebacker? I think it was. So. They got flambéed because of positional value. It's like, no, they just got dudes who can hoop. Dudes who can play. And if Will Johnson is an awesome player, forget the whole got to build the defense front to back thing. It's like, nope, you have to be nimble. You have to be able to think on your feet and to be willing to kind of change your team building ethos. If a player that good is going to fall to 11, and you think that, yeah, this guy's a day one starter who is a huge upgrade in the secondary.
Yeah, and like if you've listened to this pod for a long time, you've probably grown tired of me saying this, but like when it comes to the draft and needs in particular, needs can change at any point. You can have someone tear an ACL in an OTA practice, knock on wood, and then all of a sudden what was a loaded position, now you're missing your best player. And it becomes a quote unquote need, right? Like needs change week in and week out in the NFL just through attrition. So to say like, oh, they don't need a cornerback because they just paid Diamador Lenore and they drafted Renardo Green, it's like, all right, well, look at the rest of the position, right? Mm-hmm. Like Charvarius Ward's set to be a free agent. Isaac Yiadom is a free agent. Like that was your primary number 3 corner last year. Rock Ya-Sin, free agent. Like all these guys are free agents. So you absolutely could afford to have a cornerback, and if he's Pat Surtain, then it's a home run pick, and you forget about the fact that they had a bigger need at defensive tackle than cornerback. It's like, the initial research I've done on this draft would suggest that defensive tackle and maybe even edge is a relatively deep position in this draft, and you might be able to get starters in rounds 2 and 3. Mm-hmm. So, you could justify passing on defensive line at 11 overall or even offensive line if you get a premium player like that. So I think there was one thing I'll always go back to is like 2018 when leading into the draft, we looked at, Minkah Fitzpatrick and Tremaine Edmonds and was the pass rusher. There was a pass rush, an edge guy, I think Landry, who went
Harold
to the
Landry.
Titans. Harold Landry was in that class, and it was like, Niners fans and even me we basically looked at every other position but offensive line. And that was, of course, the draft. The Niners took Mike McGlinchey because it was like, it didn't seem like that was a need, but it turned out the Niners were ready to ship Trent Brown out of town, and right tackle actually was a need. Right. And so the broader point here is that we can get so wrapped into our priors and say, oh, they have to draft this position early on, and then it ends up being a completely different position that we weren't expecting, just because they're thinking at they're thinking at a different baseline than the rest of us. So like they could look at it and say, to your point about shifting the way they're team building, like, yeah, they're we got to cover Marvin Harrison Jr., we got to cover Puka Nacua, we got to cover Jackson Smith and Jigba, and the guys in Seattle. Like, there are plenty of reasons and plenty of elite receivers. Like, if you want to look at the Eagles, like, they have AJ Brown and Devontae Smith. Like, you got to cover those guys, right? Like, if you're going to get to the Super Bowl. So I don't find fault in the logic of saying, all right, Will Johnson's the best player on the board at 11, go get him.
And you bring up the Eagles. So much of what the Eagles have been able to do team building wise is just that. Is they just take the good players.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter where it is. It doesn't matter what they think the need is. They drafted Jalen Hurts in the goddamn second round. Immediately after Carson Wentz was an MVP candidate and got hurt, and then Nick Foles won him a Super Bowl, they just oh, hey, we're just going to draft a quarterback in round 2 because we think he's the best player. And now he's winning him a Super Bowl. So that's like I said, I think something that just gets so overlooked is in the NFL, it's pretty rare that you're just like all set at a position. And you just don't need to add, especially in the secondary, man, where you need a minimum of 3 guys who can play. And I think Bernardo Green's a good player. I think Diamador Lenore's a good player. If you're drafting a third corner that you think is going to be better than both of them, like, yeah, why would you not do that? And it makes way more sense to me than skipping a player like that to draft for need when you're drafting this high. If they were drafting 30th, I might feel different. But at 11, there's a really good chance that a player with, maybe he just didn't have a great workout, or, teams are passing on corners because they like this offensive tackle or this defensive end or whatever, and all of a sudden a player falls through the cracks to 11 where you're going, man, hey, this is a top 5 guy, and he's just here. Like, there's 1,000%. Like, that can happen at that spot of the draft. So I understand the need in the trenches, and I don't think that can really be overstated. But at the same time, in this scenario where whether it's Will Johnson at cornerback or maybe it's I haven't even looked. Maybe it's Ty Warren, the tight end from Penn State, or somebody like that, where you're like, yeah, all right, maybe that's not a need, but this is just the best dude.
Yeah,
getting good players in the building is the point.
And going back to the Eagles, they took Jalen Carter, 9th overall in 2023, after taking Jordan Davis, 13th overall in 2022. They used back-to-back picks on defensive tackles.
Yep.
And it worked.
Yep.
Right? So, like, I'm a big proponent of the idea of, like, making sure your strength is always your strength, right? Not, like... And again, the Niners' strength has typically been their defensive front. So again, I'm not arguing against adding to your defensive line. What I would push back on is just the idea that, oh, they're not going to draft Will Johnson. They're not going to think about drafting Will Johnson because it's not a trenches position. Like, if all things were equal and the talent was the same, and there was an offensive tackle or an edge player or defensive tackle and Will Johnson, and you had the same grades on all those guys, then I'm leaning towards probably a defensive lineman, right? If all things are equal, all the grading is equal, I would go there because I view that as a need. But I'm not completely dismissing the idea of Will Johnson just because you have needs in the trenches. Like, I think ultimately you just have to draft the best dudes, and that's what the Eagles did. They drafted. Oh God, I don't even remember who they drafted first. So they drafted AJ Brown before Devontae Smith, right? Like
They didn't draft AJ Brown. They traded for AJ Brown.
they traded for that's right. So regardless, they added Devontae Smith after already having AJ Brown. They added Jalen Carter after already having Jordan Davis. Right? Like you can absolutely add to positions where you're already strong. And then you can become elite at that position. And then ultimately that could be the difference between, being a playoff team and being a championship team. If you have a identity where you are elite, and you can lean into that. And that's what the Niners did. And, they added two edge rushers in 2019, and then it ended up being a big reason they went to the Super Bowl. Right. So you need multiple guys, even if you look at the Niners cornerback position as a position of strength right now, they have 2 cornerbacks. They're going to need 3. And so that's why I think Will Johnson absolutely makes sense.
And to that point, I'm grabbing Matt Miller from ESPN here because he just put out his first round grades. He has like 12 players with first round grades this year. Will Johnson is one of 2 corners with a first round grade, and he is Matt Miller's number 3 overall prospect. There's 1 defensive tackle that he has with a first round grade, and it's Mason Graham from Michigan.
Yeah.
Who's number 4 overall. So that just kind of highlights where this isn't. And I think if the Niners have a board, right, and Will Johnson is right there with Kenneth Grant. It's just another interior defensive lineman from this draft. And they're both like, hey, we have these guys with the same grade or the same tier or whatever. Then yeah, go with the defensive tackle if that's the move. But if Will Johnson is in tier 1 for them, and he falls all the way to 11, and the next defensive tackle is like in tier 2 or tier 3, that's just good team building.
Right. And the argument, or I guess the proof against we really got to draft for need is Javon Kinlaw.
1,000%.
Like that was, they traded DeForest Buckner, and they had a very clear and obvious needed defensive tackle, and they zeroed in on a defensive tackle instead of taking, Tristan Wirfs, who, I think had the 49ers taken Tristan Wirfs instead of Javon Kinlaw, I think they might have had a parade. 1 or 2. And I think that's the type, that's sort of the gravity of these decisions, right? Like had the Niners had Tristan Wirfs instead of Javon Kinlaw, I think they might have beaten the Chiefs pretty handily in last year's Super Bowl.
Well,
but I mean, again, that's like a very broad hypothetical, but that's the gravity to these situations or these decisions. So that's why it's going to get so much attention. But when you draft specifically for need and you say, okay, we're pigeonholing ourselves to taking this position in the first round because that's our biggest need, a lot of times you miss. And it can have very, very big ramifications, and maybe the ramifications is you don't win a championship because of that decision.
Yep.
So
yeah, man.
Yeah, just take the best players. That's ultimately the thesis here, is just take the best dudes.
That has to be the way they approach this offseason and this draft. Like, you got to rebuild the offensive line. You got to figure that out. You got to add on the defensive line. Like, that is no doubt. But if there's a chance to get a top 5 talent at number 11, you just do that. Yep. And you figure out the rest later. Nobody is going to begrudge you for taking a good player. Like, if Will Johnson comes in, and you mentioned Patrick Surtain the second, and that was actually Matt Miller's comp for Johnson. If you bring him in and he is just a lockdown corner that you can throw on an island, and DK Metcalf's going for 1 catch and 6 yards, and Puka Nacua is going for 3 catches and 29 yards, and he's just kicking ass every week, nobody's going to be like, boy, but the defensive line, am I right? Like, nobody's going to get mad because you took a good player.
No, and you can take Jack Sawyer in, round 2, and then I'm sure
just to offset the
tackle.
Michigan of it all.
Exactly. And somebody else, another defensive tackle in round 3 or whatever. Like, there are multiple ways to do it. I'm a big proponent of address needs in free agency and just take the best players you can in the draft. I think that's ultimately the best way to do it.
Mm-hmm. I think so too. especially early.
Yeah. Which is a pretty good argument for having free agency after the draft.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that'll ever change.
No.
So
some news before we go. Demetrius
Yeah.
Flanagan Fowles has been released. The DFF era is over. Your thoughts on the Arizona Wildcat linebacker turned safety? Safety turned linebacker. Yeah.
Yeah, no, he was a really beloved teammate. I will say, like you talked to, covering the team I covered most of his time there. Like people loved Flan. He was just a good teammate, quality special teamer, dealt with a lot of injuries. Probably not, it's not an ideal situation if he's playing linebacker for you. And I think the 49ers probably came to that realization before deciding to move on from him. But a good special teams player, played for a long time for them, just dealt with some injuries. And I would imagine that they're going to address linebacker one way or another this offseason, particularly with Trey Greenlaw headed towards free agency. So, yeah, I would round 4, round 5, round 6, they took a linebacker or two. You wouldn't be surprised, right?
No, I wouldn't. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Jalen Walker, who we've talked about from Georgia, he's like an off-ball pass rusher hybrid type of guy. Like, it wouldn't shock me at all if he falls to 11 if he's the pick.
Yeah.
Where, just get a disruptive player.
That was sort of the pre-draft scouting report for Micah Parsons. Because he was an off-ball linebacker at Penn State, and people were like, well, we don't really know what he is. So that's why, if you, in hindsight, knowing how good Micah Parsons been off the edge, he's probably a top 5, top 3 pick.
Oh, yeah, easy. Without question.
Well, there were a bunch of quarterbacks in that draft, but that might alter some teams' thinking on Walker. But the
Niners had traded 3 first-round picks to move up for Micah Parsons. That would have made sense.
I mean, wasn't he the 11th pick?
Yes, 12th.
He was 11th or 12th. I mean, they could have picked him if they didn't move up for Trey Lance. So
correct. What was the other thing on that? I was going to say one more thing on that. Oh, I feel like we're reaching a point in sports in general where the whole idea of a player being like a tweener, quote unquote, needs to go out the window. If a player is really awesome at something and you're just like, yeah, but what position does he play? Like, I don't give a damn.
I would
get him in the building.
I would argue there are people who are like, oh, well, I don't know what position he is. He's a tweener. I would argue being a tweener means you're more versatile.
Yeah, right. Oh, there's a bunch of different things you can do? Awesome.
Yeah. Draymond Green slid into the second round of the draft in large part because we don't know what position he plays.
Yeah.
He's a big in a 6'6" guy's body. Well, it turns out he can guard, at his peak, he could guard 1 through 5 and be one of the best defensive players of his generation.
Right.
But he went to the second round because, we're not sure if he's big enough to be a power forward. It's like,
right.
He might end up just being super, super versatile and change the way we think about switchability in the NBA. So.
Right. Yeah. What would Jalen Walker, for example, whether I'm writing LB or DE next to his name matters way less than what he does on the field.
Or all caps edge.
Or, well, yeah, I mean, sure.
Let's do this correctly.
Sorry. We can fix this in post. Whether you're writing LB or all caps edge next to his name doesn't matter if he's disruptive on the field.
Right. Yeah. So we'll talk a lot about a bunch of different prospects leading up to the draft. I think the mock drafts, it's less about talking about who says which player is going to the 49ers 11. I think it's just kind of a launch point for conversations to be had. If it is this player, here's why, and here's why it makes sense, or here's why it doesn't. It doesn't always have to be, oh man, that guy said Will Johnson's going to the Niners. What an idiot! That's not really the conversation.
There's no with mock draft specifically. There's no, and I don't want to spend too much time on this. I got stuff to do, but there is there is no such thing as a bad mock draft because nobody knows.
Right.
Every year, there are 3 or 4 dudes who are never mocked in the first round who go in the first round. And there are 2 or 3 dudes who fall way down below where we think they do or go way earlier than we think they do in the first round.
Ricky Pearsall and Cooper DeJean.
Ricky Pearsall and Cooper DeJean. If the 49ers picked Cooper DeJean instead, they would have won the Super Bowl. Also, I feel like I bitch about this every year. I whine about this every year, but I'm just going to do it again real quick. My bit this year is going to be I'm going to go through the draft prospects and I'm going to tweet about how much I like all of them. And then inevitably, when there's some good players, I'm going to retweet my own takes.
Because that's apparently,
yeah, that's apparently just the draft Twitter thing. Nobody ever talks about how wrong they are. Everybody just likes every prospect all the time. And then retweets it later.
I just think, like in general,
every player is good.
Victory lapping on your opinions is like, I mean, it's something people do, I guess, to self-promote, which is fine. But yeah, but I think you do it in a way that it's not like your brand. I think there are a lot of people whose brand it is to like cast a wide net and be like, oh, I love this unheard of prospect that so-and-so team just took in 6th round. And if he makes a play on a national TV game, you can retweet yourself and
yeah, exactly.
Talk about that's what you are. Whereas like all the other 6th and 7th round prospects you tweeted about who are insurance salesmen and plumbers now are like, right. There are no repercussions for missing on those.
Exactly. Guys. Exactly. That's it. Nobody's holding anyone accountable. And that's fine. That's the space. That's fine. I'm gonna wade into that space as well.
Yeah.
On the draft broadcast, it's always so funny.
Shout out to all the self promoters, man.
Every day 3 pick, but Fred Warner is my one. I will retweet my Fred Warner pre-draft tweet all the time. But oh shit, what was I gonna say? I can't remember. It wasn't that important.
Mine is famously. Go ahead.
On, I want to get to your call too, but as we sit here and self promote, no, but on like late day 3 of the draft, when every pick, there are people like love this fit. Oh, this is one of my fit. Oh, what a steal! It's like we're doing it. We're at the 219th pick, brother. Like that player is probably not going to be very good. You love the fit?
It does feel like at a certain point, it's just like throwing darts.
Yeah. Probably after the top like 50.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways,
throwing darts.
Sorry, I digress.
In order, if I can self-promote maybe my greatest pre-draft take, it was that the Niners should have drafted Patrick Mahomes. But the caveat was that they should trade to the back end of the first round to get him. Because you remember Pat Mahomes, it was like a surprise that he went 11th or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But I wrote an article at NinersWire.com. You can probably Google it. It said Niners should trade back into round 1 and go snag Patrick Mahomes to be their quarterback after taking whoever they ended. Oh, it was Solomon Thomas. And so I felt, my eval on Pat Mahomes. I think I even mentioned Brett Favre in the article. So one of my best takes, and again, probably just me throwing a dart, talking about a quarterback the Niners could select, but safe to say I feel pretty good about that take.
Yeah, no, you nailed that. You were smarter about it than Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch were.
Yeah. Well, they were looking at Kirk Cousins in free agency in 2018, so.
Yeah. I mean, you're not going to just draft Patrick Mahomes all willy-nilly when Kirk Cousins is going to be available.
I have a hard time beating out Kirk Cousins.
All right. That's all I got. I'm done for today. Draft good players.
Draft good players at premium positions.
Yep.
All right. Subscribe to podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We will be posting more videos as time goes. And 5-star reviews, heart clicks, notification bells. Leave a comment. Be part of the discourse, the narrative. If you have takes, let us know what they are. Maybe we'll respond to them. Yeah, leave us some comments.
Hell yeah. What's the, not disruptors, we are thought leaders. Come be thought leaders with us.
Goodbye, everybody.
See ya.